I never planned for anything to change that day. It was one of those gentle October mornings where sunlight fell through the trees like liquid gold, soft and forgiving. I'd just returned from my weekly shopping run, groceries loaded in the trunk, the radio humming with a melody I'd known for years. My kitchen still held the faint sweetness of the cinnamon toast I'd eaten at dawn, mixed with the sharp, clean scent of lemon. My son, David, had left that morning for a business trip that would keep him away for 10 days. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the house seemed to exhale. Not emptiness exactly, but a particular kind of silence where even the wall clock's ticking felt deliberate, almost companionable. Thomas lives just 3 houses down our street. We've been neighbors for nearly a decade now, sharing those small courtesies that build over time. A wave at the mailbox, shared laughter at the annual block party, the occasional favor when storms left branches across driveways. He's the sort of man you recognize by posture alone, not because it's striking, but because it speaks of steadiness, of someone who's learned that patience is its own reward. He's approaching 60 with silver threading through his dark hair, and he moves with the deliberate grace of someone who no longer rushes through life. When he appeared at my door that morning carrying 2 paper coffee cups like peace offerings, I assumed we'd exchange pleasantries and nothing more. "Margaret," he said, catching my eye with that particular look people have when they're checking if they're welcome. "Heading into town by any chance?" I had a prescription to collect and letters to mail, those small tasks that give shape to otherwise shapeless days. "I am," I replied, stepping onto the porch. "Care to join me?" His acceptance came wrapped in genuine gratitude, the kind that people who've learned to receive help graciously know how to express. We walked to my car together, fallen leaves crunching softly underfoot, the morning air carrying that particular autumn dampness. The drive began as I expected it would. Unremarkable, ordinary. Thomas fastened his seatbelt with the same careful attention he'd used when repairing my garden gate the previous summer. We talked about surface things. Weather patterns, the neighbor's perpetually barking terrier, the new bakery that had opened downtown. His voice had a quality to it, low and textured, the kind that makes you lean closer not from necessity but from genuine interest. Then something shifted between us. Perhaps it was how the landscape changed as we drove, suburbs giving way to wider skies and open spaces. Perhaps it was simply having nowhere urgent to be, no obligations pulling at my attention. Or maybe it was the way Thomas looked at me, truly looked. And the quiet between our words began to resonate with something unspoken. "You seem weary," he observed. As casually as noting cloud formations, it wasn't criticism. It was recognition, offered with the care of someone who knows how to hold something fragile without crushing it. I laughed, a quiet sound. "Is it that obvious?" He shrugged, fingers drumming lightly against his knee. "Only a little. You've been carrying a lot these past months. We discussed ordinary things at first. My rebellious vegetable garden, the neighbor's rooster that refused to understand Dawn, the upcoming community meeting about park renovations. Then Thomas asked about David, and I found myself talking more than I'd intended, the way you do when someone's listening without agenda. I told him about the job, about the travel schedule, about the particular ache of a house that's suddenly too quiet. He listened with remarkable attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, not offering quick fixes, simply receiving my words as though they mattered. I miss having people around, I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. I'm still learning how to be comfortable with all this emptiness. Thomas glanced at me, then back at the road ahead. "You're allowed to want more than silence," he said quietly. "You're allowed to want laughter and noise and someone asking for butter when it's already sitting right there on the table." Such a simple thing to say, yet it disarmed something in me. I laughed properly then, the kind that starts deep and reaches your eyes. The car felt warmer despite the autumn chill, and I understood then that warmth has little to do with temperature. It's about permission, about allowing yourself to want. We paused at a red light where a pigeon strutted across the crosswalk with absurd confidence. Thomas reached across the space between us, hesitated, then rested his hand lightly on mine. I could have pulled away. I didn't. It was simple contact, without drama, just one person reaching toward another. "Is this all right?" he asked softly, as though every small step required explicit consent. "Yes," I said. The word felt certain. There's a particular intimacy that arrives not through grand gestures, but through small courtesies. Asking, listening, checking in. The space between us filled with that intimacy, comfortable and startling all at once. He spoke about his former wife with surprising tenderness, about how time had softened certain sharp edges while leaving others jagged. He admitted, almost shyly, that his house had always felt lonely to him, even during the years when it was full of voices and activity. When he spoke of loss, he chose careful, honest words that held pain without letting it overflow. "I thought I was finished with new chapters," he said at one point, eyes on the road. You reach a certain point and assume you've learned the territory, that the map is complete. A pause then. Turns out the map keeps changing. That phrase, "the map keeps changing," felt like permission I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for, as though a door somewhere inside me had been unlatched and different air rushed in, carrying possibility instead of obligation. We stopped at the pharmacy and the post office. He insisted on buying lunch. It was the kind of practical give and take that made the whole thing feel less like fiction and more like something two ordinary people create together. We held doors for each other, walked side by side, and though the world continued around us with its traffic and dogs and distant lawnmowers, the air between us had fundamentally shifted. Back home, the house greeted me differently, as though it had noticed some change in me. Light moved across the floorboards in that particular afternoon way, illuminating small imperfections that suddenly seemed like markers of history rather than flaws. David called later from his hotel, cheerful and exhausted, full of stories about his meetings. We laughed together. He reminded me to water the fern and told me he loved me, as he always does. That evening, rinsing the coffee cup Thomas had used, my phone chimed with a message. "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" No pressure, no elaborate invitation. Just a simple line, careful and casual. I read it twice, fingertips resting on the screen before responding. There was anticipation there that felt almost unauthorized, a flutter of yearning that surprised me. When David called the next evening, I kept the conversation light at first. The book I'd started. The neighbor's ridiculous new gardening hat. Then he went quiet for a moment, and with the kind of directness that comes from watching your parent rediscover themselves, he asked, "Are you seeing someone?" There it was. The question with weight. He didn't ask with judgment. He asked with curiosity and concern, and underneath, perhaps relief, as though he'd been holding his breath waiting for permission to rearrange his own understanding of our lives. My first instinct was deflection. Talk about recipes. The forecast. The safe territory of small talk. Instead, I found my voice steadier than expected, and I told him the truth as gently as I could. I told him about the drive. About Thomas and his coffee. About a hand placed on mine and permission asked and given. I told him I didn't know what this would become, which was honest, but that something small and tender had happened, and it mattered. Silence buzzed on the line. I heard him take a long breath, adult and complicated. "Mom," he said finally, and the way he said it made me sit down as though my legs had been relieved of duty. "Are you happy?" The question wasn't about propriety or neighbors' opinions or what anyone should think. It was a careful, piercing question aimed directly at the center of my life. For a moment, I felt like glass. Knocked but not shattered, simply startled into a new arrangement. "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded small in the quiet kitchen. It came out honest, though not entirely complete. There's a difference between contentment and something that makes your chest expand like a window opening for the first time in years. His next question arrived wrapped in tenderness that made my throat tighten. "If you're happy, will it change things between us? Will you still be my mother the same way?" That was the moment everything crystallized. Not because he worried I'd abandon him, but because he needed to know that this new part of me wouldn't erase the foundation we'd built. That love in a new shape wouldn't demolish the old structures. I heard the vulnerability in him. Raw and brave, smiling at the sink, fingers wrapped around the warm mug. I allowed myself to believe that the map Thomas had mentioned could include new places while still honoring the old roads. "You will always be my son," I told him. "There will be changes, certainly, some small and some larger, but nothing erases that foundation. I can care for my own heart and still care for you. I can begin again and still be the woman who taught you to tie your shoes and apologize when you were wrong." He laughed, a little tearful. "Okay," he said simply. "Just tell me before you do anything wild." "I promise," I said, and the word felt sacred. After we said goodbye, I sat at the kitchen table with the radio silent so I could hear my own thoughts. The house felt different, not because anything visible had changed, but because some internal furniture had been rearranged. There was a new tension humming through everything, delicate and alive, full of potential. I didn't know what would come next. Whether Thomas and I would become people who met for coffee on Tuesdays, or whether this would remain a lovely chapter in both our stories. What I knew was that the simple act of that drive, the asking, the listening, the consent, had nudged me toward an honesty I hadn't realized I needed. When I went to bed that night, I thought about roads and maps and the remarkable stubbornness of the human heart. I thought about how David's question had cut through polite conversation straight to truth. I thought about Thomas's hand on mine in traffic, and how he'd asked permission before stepping closer. There was a soft, careful hope inside me that felt like a letter I wasn't quite ready to open publicly, but which gave me private warmth. I closed my eyes grateful for small things. Golden morning light, the scent of coffee, my son's voice. The rest would have to wait, and perhaps that was exactly the point. The next morning arrived with sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor in golden stripes, dust motes dancing lazily in the air. I stood by the window with tea in hand, letting the quiet settle around me. The house still carried yesterday's coffee scent, lingering cinnamon from breakfast, and something else I couldn't quite name. The scent of possibility. A knock at the door, soft but deliberate. I hesitated only a heartbeat before answering. There stood Thomas, holding another paper cup, smiling as if he carried morning sunshine in his hands. "Good morning," he said, voice low and calm, familiar in a way that made something in my chest loosen. "Thought you might like a refill." I invited him in. We settled at the kitchen table, our movements easy, almost choreographed. There was intimacy in such familiarity, comfort that required no explanation. He handed me the cup. Our fingers brushed, lingering just long enough to send awareness across my skin. Nothing overt but undeniable. The acknowledgement of possibility, silent permission for our hearts to begin this careful dance. We spoke of ordinary things. The neighbor's new landscaping, weather turning colder, the stubborn squirrel determined to empty the bird feeder. Our conversation felt like a gentle current beneath which deeper waters flowed. Thomas's eyes met mine frequently, patient, steady, filled with curiosity that was never intrusive but always attentive. I realized how rare it was to be truly seen without judgment or expectation, and it made me ache in an unexpected way. After a while, he leaned back and exhaled softly. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I don't want to rush anything. I simply enjoy being with you. That's all. I enjoy this, and I hope you feel the same." I nodded, words catching. I did feel the same. It was strange and startling to realize that someone could care for you in this way, tender and unobtrusive, and that you could reciprocate without fear. "I do too," I whispered. More than I realized I could. Hours slipped by unnoticed. We wandered into the living room, conversation flowing naturally from books to music to small regrets and little victories. Thomas shared stories from his youth, moments of awkwardness and loss that made me laugh and ache simultaneously. I shared stories about David, my own triumphs and failures, things I'd never told another soul. Trust was building. Subtle but undeniable, a shared space that went beyond words. Then came a pause, a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Thomas looked at me with gentle but unshakable intensity. "Margaret," he said, voice lower now, more intimate, "I don't know if you feel it yet, but there's something here between us. Something worth exploring." My heart fluttered in a way I hadn't felt in years. I realized then that I'd been protecting myself from joy, holding back because change was frightening, because vulnerability was uncomfortable. But standing there in golden afternoon light, I understood that Thomas's presence wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to consider it. "Thomas," I said slowly, carefully. "I do feel it. I think I've been afraid to admit it to myself, but yes. There is something here, something I want to understand." He smiled. A warming smile that reached his eyes and made the fine lines at the corners more pronounced. More human, more honest. "Then let's take it slowly," he said. "No rush. Just see where this goes." We spent the rest of the afternoon in easy companionship, comfortable with silence and each other's presence. When he finally left, there was no dramatic declaration, no grand gestures, just a promise of continuity. A subtle acknowledgement that our paths were now intertwined in a way that felt both thrilling and comforting. Later that evening, David called again. I could hear the city humming in the background, the tired cadence of travel in his voice. He asked how I was, and I told him honestly, I was feeling alive. A pause, a breath that seemed to carry both relief and curiosity. I'm glad, Mom, he said finally. I want you to be happy. That's all I need. I realized then how remarkable it was, the gift of acceptance from someone you've loved unconditionally. David's support allowed me to embrace my own heart without guilt, without hesitation. I could care for another adult, for myself, and still remain the mother I had always been. Days turned into weeks. Thomas and I continued our careful courtship, discovering the rhythms of each other's lives, the small joys and vulnerabilities that make intimacy real. We shared dinners, walks through the park, quiet evenings filled with laughter and conversation. There were moments of hesitation, of fear, of uncertainty, but also moments of profound connection, of honesty, of gentle growing affection that strengthened with each passing day. One afternoon, walking through autumn-colored streets, Thomas took my hand and didn't let go. The gesture was simple, unassuming, yet it carried the weight of everything we discovered together. Mutual respect, understanding, the willingness to embrace new chapters without erasing the past. I never thought I'd feel this again, he admitted softly, looking into my eyes. I thought the chance for this was gone. Neither did I replied, squeezing his hand. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. By the time David returned from his trip, he found a home both familiar and subtly transformed. He noticed laughter lingering longer, ease in conversation, lightness in my step. When he asked about Thomas, I told him the truth, that this was a slow, careful journey built on trust and shared moments, and that it was something I cherished. He smiled, a knowing, grown-up smile. I'm happy for you, Mom, really. In that moment, I felt extraordinary gratitude for the ride that started it all, for quiet courage to embrace new beginnings, for my son's unwavering support, and for the gentle, unfolding love with Thomas. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It wasn't a story of dramatic upheaval. It was something deeper, an awakening of the heart, a rediscovery of connection, a reassurance that life, even in its later chapters, still had room for joy, tenderness, and unexpected surprises. I learned that day that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about noticing, listening, and allowing yourself to be seen, truly seen by another human being. And sometimes it starts with a simple ride, a shared cup of coffee, and a question that shakes you to your core. Sitting by the window that evening, watching sunsets streak across the sky in shades of amber and rose, I thought of Thomas, of David, of the life I had built and the life that was unfolding. I realized that happiness isn't a destination. It's the quiet moments we allow ourselves to embrace, the courage to accept connection, and the willingness to trust that our hearts can expand even after years of careful guarding. And in that stillness, with the last light of day casting warmth across the room, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Fully present, fully alive, and quietly, profoundly content.